Good evening, everyone, and apologies for that small delay. We had a technical problem we had to sort out. We can promise you, though, this will be worth the wait. I'm Nathan Shapur, a political advisor at the European People's Party, and on behalf of the EPP, welcome to another episode of EPP Family Talks. Over the past several weeks, it's been our pleasure speaking with leaders from throughout our political family about the ideas and projects they've been working on during this time of coronavirus crisis. This evening, it is our great pleasure to welcome Mr. Herman Van Rompuy, former Prime Minister of Belgium, from our EPP member party, CD&V, former President of the European Council, and the current President of the European Policy Center. Mr. Van Rompuy President, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Good evening.
We've started all of these interviews by asking our leaders just a very simple question to start off, and that's just, how are you doing? How are you coping? How have you been spending your time these past few weeks?
Yeah. As all Belgians, we fall in another world. The 13th of March, all of a sudden, my agenda was empty. Almost all my lectures inside the country, outside the country were cancelled. So I was actually the first months on holidays at home. It was nice weather. We have one of the warmest springs ever in our history. After 1 month, there was meetings, panels, courses started slowly to come back, but still I had plenty of time. So I wrote articles, I wrote forwards for books, I accepted almost every invitation in order to have an activity. But all in all, it went very well. Of course, I feel very privileged. I'm a pensioner. I haven't to work anymore. I have no responsibilities. My 4 kids and 9 grandchildren, they are living all in neighborhood. So I could see them on a regular basis, of course, with respecting the social distancing. But we were in contact all the time. When I opened my television in the evening, that was another world. In this country, we lost 9,000 people. 9,000 people died from the coronavirus. So I'm a little bit embarrassed even to say I spent this period very well because other people suffered a lot. I saw also my children, they are all working to have this difficult exercise to work at home, and at the same time, they have to take care of their kids. The oldest one is 10 years old. So from 10 to 1, that's the youngest one, they have to take care of them, to give them lessons, what we call pre-teaching and all those things. So again, I'm not the real person to interview about the coronavirus because I'm too privileged.
I'd like to ask you about several of those things you mentioned that you're reading about and thinking about, but maybe just a follow-up. You mentioned it's been beautiful weather this spring in Brussels. Indeed, it's been an absolutely beautiful past several weeks. I think my understanding is that you're actually at the coast in Belgium. Have you seen a change in terms of people coming to the coast on holiday as tourists? What has been your observation in the past several weeks?
I'm at this place here in what is called the Haan aan Zee, a very small place at the Belgian coast. I'm here for 20 years. So I can assure you now when you go to the dike and to have a look at the beach, there is nobody. There is nobody. It will change the day that they really will open the beaches for day tourists. But now you have, let's say, the aboriginals from this region, and at the same time, since 1 week, those who have a second residence there. I have a second residence here in this small village, and people, those in charge of the province and of the communes, they fear that opening to the owners of second residence would create some kind of chaos, that the dike would be overcrowded, because we have 100,000 owners of second residence on our 60 kilometers coast here in Belgium, it was not the case at all. So it is here extremely calm, extremely calm. I think it is, for those who are here, one of the most beautiful times they can spend at the Belgian coast. But it will change, of course, when we will open tourism inside the country, and that will happen very soon. That will happen next week. And then bit by bit, people will come back to the coast. But most of the people are still afraid. We are living still to some extent, in an economy, in a society, in fear. And you see it on not only in terms of tourism, you see it also in the consumer. The consumer is still hesitating to spend his money because he is anxious and fearful a second wave, a rebound of the coronavirus can happen in the fall. So I expect that activity will still be at a low level, unfortunately for those who have to live from private consumption, from tourism, and all those other things. It is calm, very nice for me, but it's less nice for those who have to make a living from tourism.
If we could maybe just stay on the topic of Belgium for a moment, looking at the whole country from a political perspective, what's your view on how this government has done, and particularly on the difficulty of forming a government in this past period?
We have a government, and I mean a federal government now. Since beginning of April, I think, we have a fully fledged government. Of course, it is a minority government, but supported in the parliament. So they won a vote of confidence in the parliament. So from April to September, we have a real government with real powers. Before that, we had during almost 1 year, no, even more than 1 year, a government in current affairs. And now we have a real government having had the confidence of the parliament. But this expires in September. So again, there are negotiations, or some kind of negotiations going on in order to have a stable government after September. I cannot say if they will be successful or not. In any case, everybody is agreeing that new elections in a period that's still of crisis, economic crisis, health crisis. I said the second wave can come back in the autumn. So everybody is opposed to new elections, but that does not mean that you have a government already. It's a very ambiguous situation. But for those who are not familiar with Belgian politics, we have also regional governments. And they are in place since more than 1 year. And they have huge powers. For instance, all what is related to infrastructure, to culture, to welfare, to infrastructure, to education, all this is in the hands of regional governments and regional parliaments. So what we miss is a federal government. But the country is not abandoned, and the country is not in some way, is not in good hands. We have now a temporary federal government. We have fully fledged regional governments, and we will avoid elections. You know, in 10 countries of the European Union, we have minority governments. Belgium is not an exception. We do our best, but the country is not falling apart, not at all.
Well, let's talk about the EU level now, indeed. Of course, you were a former Prime Minister of Belgium, former President of the European Council, and you had your fair share, certainly, of major crises to deal with, starting very soon after you took office as President of the Council with the sovereign debt crisis in late 2009. My first question would be, looking back at that crisis and the current one we're experiencing now with the coronavirus, how would you compare the two?
It's a big difference. In the Eurozone crisis, there was it was an existential crisis for the European Union. In the sense, if the Eurozone would fall apart, Chancellor Merkel said this could be the end of the European Union. So it was about life or death of our monetary union, of our currency, life or death of the euro, with all the consequences for employment and unemployment. So it was a struggle for life, for the very existence, not only of our currency, but of the union. Now it's much more concrete for the people. It's about life and death of the man and woman of this country and all over Europe and even everywhere in the world. It is very personal. It is not abstract. It's not about a currency or the euro. It's about I can fall ill and I can die. 9,000 people died in this country out of 11 million. And you know the figures in the United States, in the UK, in Spain, in Italy. They're much more impressive than the Belgians, but we paid a high price for the coronavirus. And that you shouldn't forget. So this crisis is much more personal. It's changing our way of life. The Eurozone crisis was an extremely important crisis. Indirectly, the coronavirus crisis is an existential crisis for the people themselves, directly, not indirectly, as in the Eurozone, but this is affecting not only their daily life, but their life to court.
Faced with such a concrete, dire, serious crisis like the one that you've just explained, I think, and laid out, what do you see the European Union as having done right, as having done well in these past few months?
But you shouldn't forget that healthcare is not a competence of the Union. So the Union is not a super state. We are not responsible for every domain in public life. So this was a competence for the nation states, and sometimes in the nation states, even for the federal entities. In this country, healthcare is to a large extent still a competence of the federal authorities. In Germany, it is a competence of what we call the Länder, the 16 Länder, whom are part of the Federal Republic of Germany. So health is not our core business. I mean core business for the European Union. So the Union focused almost immediately on the economic consequences of the coronavirus crisis. And they rapidly could agree on a first package of measures for more than 500 billion euros. And that the happy thing is that first France and Germany could agree on an impressive package for what we call a recovery fund, financed at the European level, not financed anymore via contributions of the member states. And this is a real breakthrough. It's unprecedented. This was considered as impossible a few months ago, that the European Union, the European Commission could borrow money on the markets and invest them or let them invest in all our member states. So it was a huge effort of solidarity. And that's a key word for understanding what's happening now in the European Union. The Commission, building on the French-German proposal, has extended this package. And so we are now working on a package of 750 billion new investments in green energy, in the digital, and so many other sectors which are high on the political calendar of the European Union. So we agreed on this impressive package on 750, or the Commission agreed on it. And now it's up to the member states to give their consent. And that will be the work of the upcoming weeks. And of course, the European Council, under the leadership of one of my successors, also Belgian, Charles Michel, has a big responsibility that they have to agree on the Commission proposal. I'm confident that after long and difficult negotiations, we finally will agree, because there is no alternative. The alternative is the worst case scenario, because if we cannot agree, then there will be pressure on the Eurozone. There will be a crisis in the European Union, a crisis of solidarity. So we have to agree, and we will do so. You know, the European Union always is surprising the world. Everybody is forecasting its fall, its dislocation, and it never happened. It never happened. But we need a crisis sometimes, or very too often, to agree. I often said, with the back against the wall, the abyss in front of you, and a knife to your throat, then you find the right answers. And this time we already succeeded in the first package to agree on the first package. We will succeed also on agreeing on the second package.
I want to ask you a party political question now. Of course, the EPP has stayed very active during this past several weeks with presidency and summit meetings, with ministerial formations, with working groups, and then of course our group in the Parliament and the Committee of the Regions and different council formations. They've been doing extraordinary work. Just wanted to ask you, when you look at our EPP family, how do you see the EPP family showing leadership during this crisis?
The President of the European Commission showed real leadership, because the proposal she made a few days ago is unprecedented, almost, according to EU standards, revolutionary. And that's the work of President of the Commission belonging to the EPP family. I had also a look at opinion polls, and according to those opinion polls, the EPP is doing very well, and a very clear progress in support, electoral support, in the last months, especially in Germany, but also in other countries. So all in all, the EPP, with the responsibilities they have at the European level and at the level of the member states, they are doing their utmost to give again hope to the people, to get control over the health crisis, and to support the economic recovery that hopefully will happen starting in the autumn and in the upcoming years, because it will be a huge task to overcome this biggest recession, or the biggest depression of the last 100 years. This is the biggest economic downturn we ever had since the big crisis of the 30s. And so we are not only active in combating the virus and fighting for the health of our compatriots and the people in general, but we are also fighting for the recovery of the economy and recovery of jobs, because that's also part of daily life. Not only we have to get healthy, but we badly need jobs. So the program for the next years will be jobs, jobs, jobs.
You've talked about solidarity. You've talked about the extent of the crisis that we're now facing, the need for jobs. All that brings me to my last policy-related question before we move on to finish the interview with a couple of more impersonal questions, hopefully. And the last policy-related question is a big one. It's a broad one. In addition to being a politician, you're also an intellectual, and I know that you spend a lot of time reading and thinking, and when you can, traveling and lecturing. You were just telling me before the interview started, you gave a lecture via video conference just yesterday. So my question is, and of course, you're also president of a prominent think tank in Brussels, the European Policy Center. So my question is, when you look at what's happening now in the world, the big themes, the geopolitical developments, the tensions we see around the world, are you more of an optimist or more of a pessimist as to how the world as a whole will come through this crisis?
There's a famous saying, pessimism is a mood. Optimism is something that is related to the will. You have to be not only optimistic, you have to be hopeful. But of course, if optimism and hope is a duty, it has to be underpinned by policies. You cannot be hopeful without taking action. And if you ask my opinion more as an observer than as a politician, then there's a lot of work to do. There's a lot of work to do, but what we are facing now is the crisis of what we call international cooperation, multilateralism. In the beginning of the banking crisis, the G20 was created, the 20 most wealthiest nations in the world was created the G20 at the level of heads of state or government. It was before my time. I was not yet prime minister or president of the European Council. But people who were there, they testified about the strong will of international cooperation. We are lacking international cooperation these days. We live in a period again of growing protectionism, never seen, tariff wars. We are living in a period that some tend to compare with the Cold War, which is not the case, I find, but the simple fact that people are speaking about the reappearance of the Cold War is very symptomatic. So we see again the rise of nationalism among the global actors, sometimes nostalgic nationalism. In Russia, unfortunately, in the United Kingdom, in the United States, but nationalism all over the globe. And this is creating an atmosphere, a climate of distrust. And you badly need trust to do something positive. If there had not had been trust 10 years ago in the beginning of the banking crisis, we were not able to overcome that crisis. So in order to do something positive, for instance, the restart of our economies, you need international cooperation, and international cooperation is based on trust. So we have to give the good example in the European Union on agreeing among our 27 member states on a recovery package. I will not repeat what I said. We are on the right track. And this can be an example also for the rest of the world. But we need cooperation among the global actors and the global players, especially among the European Union, United States, and China. They have the biggest economies. And if they can agree, if they join forces, we can do much more than if we do it separately.
Thank you so much for sharing that perspective with us. I have just about a minute left, and I wanted to ask you a couple of final, more fun, more personal questions to help our viewers get to know you a bit better. And the first one is simply, is there a book or a film or a series you would recommend to people?
Yeah, I've reread the book La Peste of Albert Camus. I've read it when I was in the 20s. Now it's almost half a century ago. I reread it and I can advise it to almost everybody. You find very similar circumstances as what Albert Camus has described in his famous book. Albert Camus is Nobel Prize winner for literature. He died too soon in 1960. I have read almost everything from him, but this corona crisis was for me an occasion, an opportunity to get that book from the shelf and to reread it. And for programs, I discovered Netflix. It was not, I think many people did. And so I enjoyed a lot this series of The Crown. I started following politics at the end of the 50s, beginning of the 60s. And for me, it was a film of my youth. All those names were very familiar. And the Queen, of course, she is still there. By the way, Queen Elizabeth delivered the best speech of all heads of state or government in the world on the corona crisis. She found the right words and giving the right message. So I enjoyed her speech even more after having seen The Crown.
Well, the final question touches on that theme of literature and on the theme of finding the right words. So I know you were a poet. In particular, you were very fond of the form of haiku. And so I thought, and of course we prepared this in advance. You're not coming up with this on the spot, but I thought it would be really a privilege if we could hear as a final thought, a haiku which you've just composed.
Haiku, very briefly, is a Japanese form of poetry. 3 lines, 17 syllables, related to nature or to seasons. And in the last 5 syllables, you have to give some kind of message or you have to surprise the reader. So you asked me in advance. Here is my poem, related, of course, to the corona crisis. I will read it twice. It's very short, because if you only listened, you only have heard it once, you forget easily. So this is my poem. A lovely spring with a long, deadly storm, fighting for life. You have the season, nice weather, you have the corona crisis, and then what do we have to do? A lovely spring with a long, deadly storm, fighting for life.
I think that captures more than maybe anything else I've heard or read in recent weeks, both the sobering seriousness and the promise of life, which are both a part of this moment. So thank you again so much, Mr. Herman Van Rompuy, former Prime Minister of Belgium, former President of the European Council, President of the European Policy Center. On behalf of the EPP, thank you so much for the work you have done and are continuing to do.
Thank you. Good evening.
To all of our viewers, thanks for tuning in. Please join us again next time for our next episode of EPP Family Talks. Until then, have a great evening.